but on the other hand, it wasn't what it was cracked up to be. If we were to take a walk in 1910 down Hasting Street, I think the most dominant or initial impression that one would have might be one of some squalor. Hasting Street was not the Lower East Side of New York. It was not the same. There were no tenements, for example, where people were leaning out of windows, pulling in their wash and screaming back and forth in Yiddish to each other. On the other hand, the streets were very similar to the streets of the Lower East Side. You would have bagel stores, fish stores, kosher meat markets. There would be people of all sorts, ranging from very Orthodox Jews who would be walking around with black coats and long beards, to very secular Jews who would probably want to kill the Orthodox Jews walking with their long beards and black coats because they were anti-religion in general, but nevertheless would speak Yiddish and had this kind of Jewish culture to them. The streets were teeming. They were, people knew each other. You would have people walking down the streets with large families, with children. Even in the 1930s, when the majority of Jews no longer lived in the Hasting Street area, you would find that if they really wanted to get true bagels and true lox, they would still go back to Hasting Street, where there were still some Jewish stores, and buy fresh bagels and lox and pickled herring and salmon and fresh fish and kosher. There were great hopes on parts of both groups for the next generation. They tended to come true more for Jews who, after all, were still white and could get out of their neighborhoods and move into the professional world. They did, in spite of quotas at the University of Michigan and the med schools and the law schools. They did do that. They managed to do that. By 1930s, we're talking about the kind of economic comfort that you would never have anticipated would be that of the first generation of Jews in Detroit, or even the second generation of Jews in Detroit. Relationships between blacks and Jews, starting with the Hastings Street neighborhood, which means we take us to around 1920, and then continuing into the 20th century, are complicated. They're not simple. They are very complicated, and ought not be reduced to simple phrases. There's a joke that when congregations shared tzedek, which I think became the largest or the second largest, certainly the largest conservative congregation in Detroit, when they moved from Chicago Boulevard to Southfield, which is where they're still located, there was a great dedication of the new synagogue, and clergy from Detroit were invited, one of whom was a minister whose congregation had purchased the old Sharet Tzedek building and became a church. And this is, I think, an apocryphal story, although it may be true. The minister walked over to the rabbi after the ceremonies at the reception and said, "Take good care of the building. We'll buy it from you in 25 years." Automobile factory was a major attraction for Southern whites, Southern blacks, and for Jewish immigrants. The pattern that was established very early in the 20th century in Detroit was that immigrants, let's talk about Jewish immigrants would come to the United States, frequently settle in other cities, and then come to Detroit because they had heard talk of the $5 a day legend that Henry Ford was offering $5 a day. Same, I think, is true for working blacks and working whites from Kentucky, from across the river, from Cincinnati. They tended to come first to Cincinnati, and then they would make their way to Detroit. What in most historians' eyes is called the Great Migration refers to the migration of Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian Jews between 1880 and well, 1914, before the First World War, and then shortly after the First World War for a few years until the discriminatory, xenophobic, anti-Semitic laws were passed in Congress. These are a result of unprecedented, really, outbreak of anti-Jewish violence under the new regime in Russia, in the Russian Empire. So you get large numbers, enormous numbers of Jews migrating to the United States, a considerable number of whom eventually wound up in Detroit. When you talk about the Great Migration, when historians talk about the Great Migration and they happen to be in Detroit, you've got to be careful, because the Great Migration in Detroit is frequently used to describe the migration of black workers from the South to Detroit to get jobs in Henry Ford's factories. Those jobs became more available after 1915, I think, during the First World War, and then in the 1920s.
Well, the Jews and the blacks got along just fine, as long as they were playing the way that the Jews wanted them to play it. As a matter of fact, the Jews had the pawn shops, they had the 10-cent stores, you know, and other business, and even the little grocery stores that they had. And they got along all right with the blacks. But one thing that the black, I think one depended a lot on the other one. You know what I'm talking about? A lot of the blacks had, they would get uptight for a little money. And where would they go? To go to Eli's uncle, Joe's pawn shop or whoever, and pawn something. So that kept the Jews' business prospering, and also kept the blacks with a little pocket money, especially the hustlers and pimps and so forth and so on. So they got along just fine. I never heard of any clashes, anything between the Jews and the blacks at all.
I think a lot of the money did come from the Jews that helped supported the black people. And I don't know, we got along fine. We were around the ethnic groups. There were Romanians, Yugoslavians, Italians, Czechoslovakians. It was all ethnic groups around there, and we had no problems getting along at all.
I think Detroit became one of the most ethnically divided cities in the United States, in part because it attracted people from other cities to the automobile industry. So you had very large Polish enclaves, very large Hungarian enclaves, Romanian enclaves, Jewish enclaves, and they brought with them the prejudices that had been so deeply ingrained for hundreds of years in Europe to Detroit. And even to the point of having sometimes street violence erupt. There's one incident in the 1920s when young Jewish males marched down the street. In fact, it was Hasting Street, I believe, as young Polish males marched in the other direction with clubs and baseball bats, and there was a riot. There was a street fight. They tended to avoid each other. They tended to be very much autonomous groups. Jews dealt primarily with Jews, Poles dealt primarily with Poles, Romanians dealt primarily with Romanians. And the same is true, I think, for racial groups. Blacks tended to stay in black neighborhoods and dealt with blacks. It's a very complicated question because Jews and blacks shared that they were kept separated, isolated in a sense, by the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. They also, I think, shared a sense that this was almost voluntary. Jews tended to stay together in part because they were discriminated against, but also because they felt more comfortable with other Jews, or at least Eastern European Jews, with other Eastern European Jews. And I think there was that sense among blacks as well, that they knew they were isolated, alienated from the mainstream of white American society, but there was something comfortable about staying in their own neighborhoods as well. It's not to say it was pleasant all the time. It's not to say that it was there was any choice even. But there was this sense of at least you could be yourself with your own group. I think Jews and blacks shared that, and I think to a large extent in the 1920s and 30s there was a dialogue between blacks and Jews in which they discussed issues like that.